Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Kakuzo Okakura's The Book of Tea. Kanpai. So, The Book of Tea was written in 1906, and basically it is a response to Westerners' lack of understanding of East Asian culture, particularly Japanese culture, but also Chinese culture. And so while the book is basically about Teaism, Teaism, which is a sort of not necessarily religion as such, but it's an aesthetic practice that's rooted in Chinese and Japanese religions, particularly Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, and Taoism. Teaism is an aesthetic movement, though, but it's also a philosophical movement rooted in a way of engaging with the world. And really what Okakura's trying to do throughout this book is to give a better understanding of East Asian cultural traditions through the lens of tea. So he starts, and there's actually a lot of really beautiful passages in this, some of which I'll read to you, some of which I won't. But he starts the beginning of this. Tea began as a medicine and grew into a beverage. In China, in the 8th century, it entered the realm of poetry as one of the polite amusements. The 15th century saw Japan ennoble it into a religion of aestheticism, Teaism. Teaism is a cult founded on the adoration of the beautiful among the sordid facts of everyday existence. It inculcates purity and harmony, the mystery of mutual charity, the romanticism of the social order. It is essentially a worship of the imperfect, as it is a tender attempt to accomplish something possible in this impossible thing we know as life. The philosophy of tea is not merely aestheticism in the ordinary acceptance of the term, for it expresses, conjointly with ethics and religion, our whole point of view about man and nature. It is hygiene, for it enforces cleanliness. It is economics, for it shows comfort and simplicity rather than in the complexity, the complex and costly. It is moral geometry, inasmuch as it defines our sense of proportion to the universe. It represents the true spirit of Eastern democracy by making all its votaries aristocrats in taste. So these are some high ambitions for tea that Okakura is setting here. But I think he makes a good case for them over the course of the book. In a way, what Okakura sort of argues for here is almost like the Romantic tradition in the West. The period around the late 1700s into the early 1800s. The era of people like Byron, Wordsworth, Keats, Goethe, people like this, who have these sort of notions of freedom combined with aesthetics, combined with the sort of ephemeral or ethereal truths and realities of existence. All of these things are at play in Teaism, according to Okakura. He moves relatively systematically through this. There's several chapters here. First, the cup of humanity, the overall gist of which is that not only is tea a universalizing beverage because it is loved and consumed throughout the world, it's also a philosophical, aesthetic, and artistic beverage. We have the schools of tea, in which he talks about the evolution of tea drinking from its earliest days, the sort of basic medical uses in the earliest Chinese consumption of tea, up through the refined Japanese tea ceremony, and then through the global trade in tea. Taoism and Zenism. This is a chapter that at first glance is less directly connected with tea, because it's about these two religious traditions in Japan. But what Okakura shows is that the fundamental assumptions of impermanence, of simplicity, of the transitory nature of existence that we see in Taoism and Zen Buddhism are incorporated within and inform the tea ceremony. We have a chapter on the tea room, which describes the actual physical space and the ethical and aesthetic logic of the space. Art appreciation, about Okakura here is interested in kind of the difference between traditional art, which is this is a basic gloss of what he says, but basically traditional art, the masters are not concerned with themselves. They are concerned with letting the artwork speak as itself, whereas modern artists, so that is 19th century into the early 20th century artists, were concerned with expressing themselves. There's a chapter on flowers, because the ethics of flowers and the ethics of flower arranging are very central to the Japanese tea ceremony. Flowers are an important part of the aesthetics and the decor of a proper tea ceremony. And then there's a chapter on the tea masters and what that actually means. So, in terms of one of the overarching themes, one of the threads that we get throughout the book is this idea that tea is art. Tea is an aesthetic. And so, at the beginning of the second chapter, The Schools of Tea, Okakura writes, "Tea is a work of art and needs a master hand to bring out its noblest qualities. We have good and bad tea as we have good and bad paintings, generally the latter. There is no single recipe for making the perfect tea, as there are no rules for producing a Titian or a Cison. Each preparation of the leaves has its individuality, its special affinity with with water and heat, its own method of telling a story. The truly beautiful must always be in it. How much do we suffer through the constant failure of society to recognize this simple and fundamental law of art and life? Li Chilai, a Song poet, has sadly remarked that there were three most deplorable things in the world: the spoilage of fine youths through false education, the degradation of fine art through vulgar admiration, and the utter waste of fine tea through incompetent manipulation." So again, this is very much rooted in aesthetics. It's very much rooted in an appreciation of nature and natural ethos, etc., etc. And we see this, again, consistently throughout these chapters. In the chapter on the tea room, for instance, we have a very specific idea about simplicity and humility. And those ideas are not only represented within, but actually established by the space itself. So Okakura spends a good amount of time comparing and contrasting between Western aesthetics and Western architecture and interior design, which is often very cluttered. We often have a lot of stuff. I mean, you can see even here, just in this smallish frame, that I have a good amount of stuff around me. For the wealthy people that he's particularly talking about in the early 1900s, this would be big houses, Edwardian styles, very, very lavish types of interior decor with a lot of paintings, a lot of furniture, a lot of art, a lot of possessions of various kinds. The tea room is very much the opposite of that. It is a simple, almost blank space in which possibility is central to the aesthetic. The art, the designs tend to be fairly minimal. They tend to be very simple, but they tend to be masterpieces. So this is a different approach. The simplicity of the space, for instance, reminds us of humility. It reminds us of the value of contemplation. So rather than having a lot of things to look at, you have a flower or a flower arrangement, or you have a poem or a painting or whatever it is, and that's the thing that you contemplate. That idea, and again, this connects us in a way back to Zen Buddhism, especially that idea of mindfulness, of focusing on a particular thing and letting that be central to your mind. There's also low doors entering into the tea rooms, and so this forces the guests low. It forces them to humble themselves in going into the tea room. So again, it's about all, like, it's an element that pervades the tea ceremony and everything related to it. These ethics of humility, of transcendental or transitory experiences, the focus on the moment, etc., etc. Imperfection is another component of this. Perfect imperfection, though. And this is a really interesting element of it. And again, this is where to me it seems like Teaism has much in common with the Romantics. Because the Romantics, one of the things that they loved was landscaping or outdoor spaces that looked to be in disrepair. So, fake ruins. They would build gardens with ravines or cliff faces or things like this. And it had these very sort of run-down, spooky, maybe spooky, but these very sort of run-down, ruined type aesthetics, but they were very carefully cultivated. We get the same kind of thing here in Teaism. And so, for instance, we have this story that Okakura relates. He says, Rikiyu was watching his son Shoan as he swept and watered the garden path. Not clean enough, said Rikuyu, when Shoan had finished his task, and bade him try again. After a weary hour, the son returned to Rikuyu. Father, there is nothing more to be done. The steps have been washed for the third time, the stone lanterns and the trees are well sprinkled with water, moss and lichens are shining with a fresh verdure, not a twig, not a leaf have I left on the ground. Young fool, chided the tea-master, that is not the way a garden path should be swept. Saying this, Rikuyu stepped into the garden, shook a tree, and scattered over the garden gold and crimson leaves. scraps of the brocade of autumn. What Rikuyu demanded was not cleanliness alone, but the beautiful and the natural also. And there's one more passage I want to read to you in terms of this. And this is connected, this is from the chapter on flowers. Because again, flowers and flower arrangements, particular types of flowers, particular presentations of flowers, are central to the traditional aesthetics of the tea room. So, what it says here, sad as it is, we cannot conceal the fact that in spite of our companionship with flowers, we have not risen very far above the brute. Scratch the sheepskin and the wolf within us will soon show his teeth. It has been said that a man at 10 is an animal, at 20 a lunatic, at 30 a failure, at 40 a fraud, and at 50 a criminal. Perhaps he becomes a criminal because he has never ceased to be an animal. Nothing is real to us but hunger, nothing sacred except our own desires. Shrine after shrine has crumbled before our eyes, but one altar is forever preserved, that whereupon we burn incense to the supreme idol, ourselves. Our God is great, and money is his prophet. We devastate nature in order to make sacrifice to him. We boast that we have conquered matter and forget that it is matter that has enslaved us. What atrocities do we not perpetrate in the name of culture and refinement? Tell me, gentle flowers, teardrops of the stars standing in the garden, nodding your heads to the bees as they sing of the dews and the sunbeams, are you aware of the fearful doom that awaits you? Dream on, sway and frolic while you may in the gentle breezes of summer. Tomorrow a ruthless hand will close around your throats. You will be wrenched, torn asunder limb by limb, and borne away from your quiet homes. The wretch, she may be passing fair. She may say how lovely you are while her fingers are still moist with your blood. Tell me, will this be kindness? It may be your fate to be imprisoned in the hair of one whom you know to be heartless, or to be thrust into the buttonhole of one who would not dare to look you in the face if you were a man. It may even be your lot to be confined in some narrow vessel with only stagnant water to quench the maddening thirst that warns of ebbing life. So, Okakura is very interested in this particular chapter about the aesthetics or the ethics of flower arranging, because flower arranging and the use of flowers is central to the aesthetics of Teaism. But one of the things that he argues is that the tea master is always conscious of the violence inherent in gathering flowers. And in this sense, the tea master and even the Japanese flower master, whose violence against flowers is much more widespread than the tea masters. Even the Japanese flower master is more ethically aware of this than the Westerner, we in the West still today, we use massive amounts of flowers for weddings, for funerals, for Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, whatever it is, and then they largely are just discarded. One of the things that Okakura makes very clear in this book is that part of the ethos of Japanese tradition, of East Asian tradition, Chinese, Japanese traditions, involves a much more thorough awareness of the temporary nature of things. And this is embodied in the tea ceremony. This is embodied in Teaism as an aesthetic and religious practice. And so the ethics of East Asian cultures simplicity, harmony, impermanence, etc., are drawn through these particular rituals.